Hello and welcome to the session. I'm Connie from Exlibris Training Services. Today's session, that's entitled Reveal Analytics for Resource Management, is mostly going to be presented by Dominic, and so I'm going to let him go ahead and get ready to do that. A couple of other notes. The content of the session is going to move along quickly, and for this reason, we recommend that you not be following along in analytics at your associated with your own institution at this particular point. You will be receiving a lengthy document that has screen captures and descriptions that will help you work through the examples after the session concludes. As Ray has noted, the session is being recorded for later viewing, so you'll be able to have access should you need that kind of assistance as well. One last thing, should you be new to analytics, you may find that it will be useful to review other recorded training content that's available via the Exlibris Knowledge Center, just to help you with building your knowledge. In the meantime, Dominic, go ahead.
Right, so I just wanted to reiterate our document that we're referring to is available here on the 2020 Knowledge Days article. And it is much more than just our slides and demos. We actually have a lot of bonus material available that we won't have time to get to today, and a lot of step-by-step instructions for creating these reports and working through these exercises. So definitely check that out. I'm going to go ahead and log into our training environment so we can get started. Our environment has a preview of a new interface for Rialto, so that's why it looks a little bit different, but please just ignore that. We're going to go into Design Analytics, which would be at the top of your Alma environment, and log in. And we have a number of example reports that we've created for this session, which we will be working through today. And these will be available to you as well by the end of the day tomorrow. They are located under the shared folders, community, reports, and under this Knowledge Days 2020 folder. If you're working through these exercises, we recommend saving a copy of these reports in your own institution's shared folder, just so that these reports can remain unmodified. And also for the first example we're going to be looking at, it will be necessary to do this so that we can create an Alma widget. So I'm going to click on this More button and then click Copy and move this over. In our training environment, our institution training, but you should see your institution name there. And if I click on this paste icon, the folder will be copied over, as well as our examples. Just open this first example and then briefly talk about what we're doing with this first report. So there are a number of resources that Exlibris has made available for the current COVID-19 crisis. It includes a lot of instructions on how to make certain changes in Alma or Primo and other products that you might not normally make, things like closing your pickup libraries and extending due dates and things like that. And one of the things that is available under the Alma and Primo Q&A is a tutorial on how to temporarily activate electronic collections that are freely available. We have a separate article called List of COVID-19 and Temporarily Free Resources that has a list of these resources, and these are just offered from various providers, which have different dates that this access is expiring, or in some cases we don't know exactly when they're going to be expiring that access. If you do have these activated or are planning to activate them, we recommend that you use the active until date field in Alma while activating these collections, so that when the access expires, you don't continue to have these resources available. that introduces a new electronic resource management task that another thing to keep track of on top of probably what is a large list for you already. And so in this first report, we'd like to explore how to make a report in analytics that makes that process easier and sort of automatic for you. So this first report we're going to look at is called Upcoming Electronic Collection Deactivations, and it's just a list of some temporarily activated electronic collections that have active to dates that are expiring soon. Now, as this report is currently configured, the active to date filter is just some static dates. So today until June 30th, and this means, that we would need to continue updating these dates if we were looking at this report in the future. So in our first exercise, we're going to look at how we can use functions in analytics to automatically update these dates and instead have a report that shows a rolling active to date between today and next month, whenever that happens to be. So we could add these functions directly into this filter, but I'd like to show briefly what these functions do, what the data looks like, so that it's clear what they're doing when we add them to the filter. To that end, I'm going to just add a temporary field. It doesn't matter what field you select because we're going to be removing it later. And we're going to go to the Edit Formula menu under field that we just added. And from here, you can make various changes to the field using functions. In this case, we don't actually want this availability field, so I'm going to delete the column formula. And I'm going to click on this Insert Function button. And then under the Calendar and Date folder, I'm going to select Current Date. And this is a very simple function. You just enter current underscore date, and it returns the current date, whatever that happens to be. So I'm going to click OK and OK again, and go to the results to show you what this looks like. As we can see, today's date is displayed, and it's not actually connected to any of the rows of data in this report. It's just going to show the current date regardless of what other values are here. That function is going to be our first date replacement. We're going to be replacing the static date with the current date. For the next one, the function that we're going to use is called timestamp add. It's a little bit more complicated. This function basically allows you to take a date or time and increment it by some amount. The amount that you increment it is in this second parameter here, this expression parameter. You would add a 1 or 2. You can also use negative numbers to go to previous dates, and then the interval is the parameter that is the unit of date. So in our case, we're going to use this SQL TSI month interval so that we can get next month's date, but you could also choose week or day or other intervals. And then lastly, this timestamp parameter, this would normally be a date format like this, but we're going to be putting our current date function in that parameter so that we are incrementing whatever the current date is. Okay, so once I've added, analytics has put current date in the expression parameter, which is not what I wanted. So I will move it over to timestamp. I'm going to add a 1, the SQL ESI month interval. So this function should give me next month's date is. If I go to results, June 7th appears. So both of the parts of our function that we want to add as a filter. Before I delete this field, I'm going to just copy this text so I don't have to type it all in again later. And then click delete. And I'm going to go to the edit filter button to bring up the edit filter menu. Now, because these are functions, these are SQL functions, we can't enter them directly into these value fields. But if we go to add more options, SQL expression, we can add two fields that will behave in the exact same way with the is between filter operator. And I'm just going to paste that date in there, current date. So now we have that should give us active to dates that are between now and next month. And if I go to results, see that we've got just that. And if we were to run this report next month, we would see a different list of results. So an improvement on the report, but we want to make this even easier for ourselves and not even need to go into analytics and look at this report to get this information. So I'm going to go ahead and save this analysis. And if I go back to Alma, go to the analytics menu and select analytics objects list, and then select new Alma analytics object. I will be able to where I can see this report display on my Alma homepage. Called Coming Electronic Collection Deactivations. And I will select from our institution folder the folder where our report was located and select that report from the name. And then under type, I'm going to select widget. One last step that we need to take here is to add a role for the widget so that only people with that role can view this widget. So I'm going to click Add Role. And for this particular report, what makes the most sense is the electronic inventory operator extended. Since this role allows the user to delete electronic collections, people with this role would be able to take some action on these electronic collections that appear in our report. So I'm going to click Add Role and then click Save and go back to the page. And I can either click this plus button or this Add Widget button and check this box to add this widget to my homepage. So now if I come back next week or next month, this report will have incremented and I will be able to see collections that have an active to date that is expiring soon and that I may need to take some action on this, maybe to date or deactivating and deleting the collection if our access is no longer available. So this was just a short example to show how we can use some of these functions to improve these reports. In our next report, we're going to look at another set of built-in functions that are a little more complicated that allow us to modify some of the data that appears in these reports. So if I go to back to analytics and click on catalog link, I will get back. And for this second report, we're going to be looking of items that have volumes, and they are separated out by location. In this particular environment, we have location names that may be different from your own, and we recommend for this exercise filtering this report by a specific location, but we couldn't put a location in that would be something matching all of your environments. And so this part of the exercise, since it is dependent on some of your data, we will need to add a location name filter. So I'm going to go to this menu on filter and choose a location for our choose a location with a relatively small number of results, just so we have some manageable data to look at. So I'm going to choose this main reference location and go to the results. We can see a number of titles and volume information that was populated in the enum field in Alma, but we can see a couple of issues here. First, it looks like we were inconsistent with two of these titles. When we entered the volume information, we have this vol dot prefix instead of just the numbers. And then another thing we're noticing here is this somewhat annoying sorting issue. And the reason for this sorting issue is that because you're able to enter text in the enum field in Alma, for example, adding vol or volume, in addition to numbers, when it's mapped to analytics, this field is mapped as a text field. And so instead of sorting numerically, where we would have 1, 2, 3, we have an alphanumeric or a string sort. So 1, and then because 10 begins with 1, that shows up as the next value instead of 2. So correct this problem using functions in analytics. There's a number of different ways we could approach this. We're going to show one in this presentation, but we have some other examples that are shown in that accompanying document that I mentioned earlier. So if I go to criteria and then go to edit formula for the enum field, and go to our function menu, that we're going to demonstrate in this case is a function that allows us to convert this enum string into a number field, and then analytics will be able to sort it properly. And that function is called cast. Cast basically takes a field and converts it into a different data type. So converting from a string to a number or a number to a string. There's a lot of different options available for this particular function. And if you click on this help menu, the Oracle documentation for this function will appear. Here is that documentation. And it provides a list of available data types that you can convert. One thing that isn't shown in this particular document, but is available in a different Oracle documentation that we have linked in our accompanying document, is a table that also shows you what types of data you can convert from one to the other. Since you can't convert all data types from one into another, this can allow you to see if what you want to do is possible. So the normal text fields are typically char or varchar, and what we want to convert this into is an integer. So if I look at this table, I can see that that operation is allowed. So I will be able to use this cast function to do that. So if I click OK, this cast function will, our enum field will appear as the first part. So this is the field that we're converting. And then the type section is something that we will have to change. And I'm going to change int for integer. Now, there is one more problem we have to discuss with this function. As it currently exists, this function would actually give us an error if we went back to the results. And the reason for that error is those vol1 and vol2 values that we saw earlier. Those contain strings. This cast function, unfortunately, isn't smart enough to know that it should just ignore those and just focus on the numbers and just convert those numbers. Instead, it will give us an error. And so we're going to need to replace or remove those values so that only the numbers appear. Now to do this, we'll use a different function, and we can actually nest functions inside of other functions to allow us to do that. And what I'm going to do before I click on that function button again is just highlight the enum A field. That way when I add the function, that will my enum A field inside of the function, and I will be able to not have to type that in again or select it again from this menu. So I'm going to click Insert Function again. And the function I'm going to look at here is under the string folder. It's called replace. Replace basically takes a string and finds some text within that string and then makes the replacement. The example that Oracle gives here is a string ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks for 1, 2, 3 and replaces it with ZZ. So we would see, unfortunately it doesn't show the example here, but we would see ABCD, ZZ, and then 4. So if I click on OK, we can see that the replace function was nested inside of the cast function, and the first is our field. So all I need to specify is the text that we're going to find and then the text we're going to replace. When entering strings and text into your functions, you want to use single quotes to surround them. Double quotes are reserved for fields like enum A here. So when I put in vol period and also the space after the vol, I'm going to surround it with single quotes. And then because I don't want to replace this with other text, I just want to remove it, I'm going to enter 2 single quotes to remove that. One last thing we can do, if I were to click OK and go to results, this would be our column name, which is long and not very useful for reporting purposes. So I'm going to make a custom heading by checking this custom heading box. And I'm just going to call this field volume, since that's the volume information. And if I click OK and go, once this loads, we should see. So in addition to removing that vol1, vol2, and replacing it with 2, we can see that we also converted this into numbers, and now these volumes are sorting properly. Now, this is working fine for this very small location, but of course, we expanded to other locations, or we had a staff member type in volume1 or V1 or something else like that into our enum A field in Alma. This function would not replace that text, and the cast function would give us an error again. Now we could add yet another replace function for volume, but we would have to keep coming up with more and more of these. Our function would become very, very large, and we would start basically playing whack-a-mole with our data. What would be a lot better is if there was some way for us to only include the numbers and make sure that that number was always included, regardless of what other data appeared. We would basically want to extract just the number from that. And this is possible in analytics. The function for this is a little more complicated, and it's what we will look at in our next example report. But just wanted to briefly mention that in our accompanying document, we actually do continue looking at this report. We use a couple of different functions to provide an alternative way to do this, and then we actually come back later with the advanced function we're about to talk about to finish this and make sure that this report is more reliable and won't fail just because somebody added something different into the enum A field. But for now, let's move to the next report so we can talk about this more advanced function. This third report is a shelving locations report, but it's shelving locations specifically from the holding records to mark field. And what we would like from this report is to extract just this subfield C, so biology, bio, that's the only text that we would want from this particular report, so that we can total the number of items by these shelving locations. As you can see right now, we can't really get an easy to see total because we have all of this other information in the 852 mark field. We're using the 852 mark field here as an example because we know that it should be in your environment. But another common use case for this particular function would be if you happen to have any local param or holding local parameters mapped in your Alma environment. Since that would be a different for every environment, and in some cases you might not have any mapped, we wanted to use this example just so we could make sure that there would be some data and you could follow along with the exercise. So criteria, and we will be editing this 852 mark field. I just want to show briefly that this is just a very simple report with active items and 852s that are not null. There's a bit of explanation we have to get through before we can make this replacement. This particular advanced function is not as simple as some of the other functions that we looked at, but I also want to note that it is technically possible to remove the rest of the 852 mark field using just those built-in functions from that insert function menu. The problem is that that function becomes very long and complicated, and I'd like to show you what this looks like, but we're not going to be focusing on this function. Now, if this is the first time you've seen this function and you already understand everything it's doing, I'd like to offer you a job in support. Just kidding, but this is quite a long and somewhat complicated function. It's using a lot of nested functions, some which we haven't looked at before. And if you wanted to change this and adjust this function so that you could use a different field, or you could retrieve a different subfield from 852, like subfield B, there are multiple changes you would have to make in this function. And if certain things changed, like the way that the subfield data appears in the field, you might have to adjust some of these numbers and things as well. So while it is technically possible, this would be a difficult function to maintain over time if there are changes in the data or the structure of the data in analytics. So we'd like to look at something that's a little more general. Now in the function menu, there is a special function under this DB functions menu called evaluate. Evaluate is, you can tell the syntax is a lot more complicated, and what this function allows you to do is basically run database functions that aren't available in this list but are understood by the database behind analytics. And the reason this syntax is kind of complicated is that what you would enter into the evaluate function depends on what database function you're using. So I'd like to show you a sort of simplified version of this syntax that will meet our needs for the database function that we'll be looking at. So, and sort of treat this in layers because understanding it at first will be a little complicated, but at the end of this, you'll have a function that you can more easily reuse in other contexts, and you won't necessarily need to remember every part of the syntax. You can copy most of it from the existing example. So the first layer of this function is just that evaluate function, and I want to present this simplified version of the syntax from what we saw in Oracle. Basically, we're going to be entering the database function in single quotes at the beginning, and then there will be at least one expression which will be our field. So in this case, this will be the 852 mark field. There may also be additional expressions beyond this that are separated by commas. And these functions will be possible to reference inside of the database function basically by using this reference format. Using percent and 1 or 2 will give you the expression 1 or expression 2. So in our example, we'll be using %1, and then we'll have at the outer layer of this function in evaluate, we'll have the first expression, which will be the 852 mark. Then we'll have additional percent and numbers, which will refer to the expressions afterwards in evaluate. And those will be the settings of the function that we use. So that's the first level. The second layer we're going to be looking at is just the database function itself. And the function we will be looking at here is a regular expression extension of the substring function. So the regular substring function in analytics allows you to select part of the text in analytics in a particular field. You normally specify a beginning location in the text numerically, and then also give it a length. So you might say, I want the, starting from the second character, I want the next 5 characters in substring. In this regular expression substring function, we're able to extend that and use what are called regular expressions, which we will discuss later, but I just want to focus at the moment on this database function's parameters. So there is documentation available for this, not through the normal Oracle articles, but through a separate Oracle database document. Again, this article will be linked in our accompanying document. And the regular expression substring field parameters are defined here. This diagram looks a little confusing, and I think it helps to just sort of have a slightly simplified version of this. But basically what it's trying to express here is that there are 2 required parameters, and then the remainder of the parameters, which I've italicized here, are optional. The source car parameter, which is how it appears in that Oracle documentation, is basically the field that we want to perform this search on. In this case, we're going to be putting in a %1 to reference that 852 mark field that we are trying to modify. The pattern parameter, that's where our regular expression will go, and we will talk about regular expressions in a little bit. The position is optional, and by default, this value is just 1. This position is just where in the field we're going to be starting. So in the 852, by default, we would start at position 1, which would be the beginning of the 852 data. But if you wanted to start, 5 characters into 852, you would put in 5. Although this is optional because we want to eventually use this last parameter, we're actually going to be entering in our function, we're going to be entering the default parameter so that we can get to these other parameters and specify them. The occurrence parameter, this is the occurrence of this pattern that we're going to specify in the field. So we're going to be leaving this as 1 in our example as well. But for example, if you had an 852 field where you had 2 subfield C's and you wanted to only match the second one, you would set this occurrence to 2. It would be the second occurrence of that pattern, which would be the pattern that we use to retrieve that subfield C. Match parameter changes the default matching behavior of this function. In this example, we're not going to be using this. We're going to be leaving this value as null. But we have an example in our accompanying document where we do use this. And we basically set a case-insensitive flag so that our pattern can use both upper and lowercase letters without us having to specify those upper or lowercase letters. But in this particular example, we won't be using this. We're just entering it so that we can get to our final parameter, which is called SubExpression. this sub-expression takes allows you to take part of the pattern that you're matching and return that data. And we're going to be using that for what are called capture groups, which is a regular expression operator that we're going to discuss in our next section. But I just wanted to note that these are the parameters we'll be having in our database function. And when we enter these into our evaluate function, it will look like this. This function basically has everything that we're going to use in our final version except for this regular expression. I wanted to keep that as a separate discussion. Basically, 6 of the parameters are specified here as references using this %1, 2, 3 syntax, and then %1 is referring to this 852 mark, %2 is our regular expression, and then these remaining parameters are all the default parameters except for sub-expression, which we need for our capture group. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about our final part of this function, which is our regular expression. So we could give a whole presentation just on regular expressions. They're basically a tool you can use to match patterns of text. So in our previous example, we looked at vol and followed by a period. And we talked about how if we used volume or v or some other variations, we wouldn't be able to catch those in our replace. Using regular expressions, we can define a pattern that matches all of those different types of text. And we're going to be doing that in this case as well, so that we can match on the subfield C of the 852 mark data and return just that subfield C data without actually knowing what that data is. So we'll be expressing that with this regular expression. To also note in our accompanying document is that the allowed regular expression operators are also defined. This article talks about the different expressions you can use, and we'll be introducing some of these in this next section here. But we don't have time to cover all of them, and overall regular expressions is its own topic. It's something that shows up in a lot of other contexts besides just analytics. Now, I'm going to use a tool that is called RegXer. This is, if you type in RegXer into Google, you'll find it. It's just a website that there are many other websites like this, and also tools built into things like text editors that allow you to test out regular expressions and kind of see what you're working on before you enter this into analytics. It's a lot quicker to determine the regular expression you want using a tool like this compared to going back and forth between the results and criteria tabs. In this section here, we can enter some example data. And so I'm going to go back to analytics and retrieve some example data really quick. So I'm just going to take a couple of example fields here that have different C values, so I can have various data to work with. I'm holding down the control button as I click on these so that I can select multiples, and then I'm going to hit Control C so that copies it into my clipboard and paste these in here. And then our regular expression can be defined at the top, and as we start typing it, can see the highlights, see the matches that happen with this regular expression. Now, for this first one, this is an extremely unimpressive regular expression and not one you would normally use regular expression functions for, but I just wanted to note that a regular expression can actually just be static text like this. You can specify a B followed by an I followed by an O. It's just not very useful. But whenever you do have some static text that is going to remain the same in all of this, you can specify these values. But we're going to actually do that with the first part of our regular expression, which is the subfield C parts, because we always see it at $2 followed by a C. One more thing to note here, normally a $sign is a special character. It's a regular expression operator, and it normally matches the end of a string. So something over here at the end of the line, if we had, for example, 7, I think. Oh, that's not matching for some reason. Okay. Well, in any case, the $sign, because that matches the end of the string, if we want to actually retrieve a $sign, we need to do what's called escaping this regular. The way we escape this is by using a backslash. So using the backslash character, this tells the regular expression, I want an actual $sign symbol. This is common for a lot of different punctuation, including the backslash itself. If you had data where there was a backslash and you wanted to match it, you would actually need to use 2 backslashes to escape the first one. So that's what we'll need to do for our $signs. And we know that we need 2 $signs and a C, and our data also has a space after the C. And then we want to match the rest of this up to a space and another $sign. Now, the way we can do this is through specifying what's called a set. In regular expressions, if you use square brackets, you can define a set of characters that matches multiple different characters. So for example, I could put in a B and a G, and we can see that both B and G are matching in this case. You can also specify a range of characters. So for example, all of the lowercase letters could be specified, A through Z, but we see that that's not met these capital letters. We can also specify capital letters to match as well. We could specify number ranges as well. And basically you can enter as many characters as you want under these sets between these brackets to create that set. One last thing to note, which will be important for our purposes about sets, is if you want to match anything except for these characters, you can specify the caret symbol to negate the set. And we're actually going to do this in our regular expression because we don't know if our locations might have numbers or other kinds of symbols. What we really want is to match any text from the start of this until we reach either a space or a $sign. And so we're going to be entering that in here. So this set will match anything for a $sign or a space. Now, the last part of what we need to do here is basically to specify the amount, the quantity of characters. This set by itself, only a single character, as we can see, it's not the rest of biology or grad. Quantifier that we can use, in this case, there's several that are available. The one we'll use in this case is a plus sign, which will match one or more of the character set that we've defined here. So as we can see, this is matching the subfield C, also matching the $2 signs and a C portion. So the last regular expression concept I want to introduce is called a capture group, and the can be specified with parentheses like this. And what that allows us to do is basically capture just the part of the data that we want, so just biology, as you can see, this group 1. So this is our final regular expression for this example. And if I to enter it in function, we get our final version of our function here. I'm going to copy this, put this into our report. And I'm going to give this a custom 852 subfield C. Go to results. What we is that all the 852 data has been, except for the subfield C data that we were interested in, has been removed from from this, and as a result, we are now getting items totaling correctly. Now this syntax may look complicated, and it may not be much more or complicated than the built-in functions we were looking at earlier. But what's nice about this function is it's easy to reuse. If you need a different field, for example, local param field, you can specify it here without changing any of this. And if you want to change the regular expression to match a different pattern, you can change that and maybe make one or two changes to the other parameters depending on your needs. But you don't need to sort of rewrite large portions of the expression. Similarly, minor changes like matching subfield B would just be a matter of changing one character. Okay, so we're basically at the end of our report demonstrations. As I mentioned, there's a lot of additional material in our accompanying document, a lot of step-by-step sections that we had to cover very quickly. And we'd like to reserve the last portion of our presentation here for questions.
Dominic, this is Connie. I've been noting some questions, and I will just read them out as they are stated, and then I'll give you an opportunity to respond. So, from Elizabeth. In the past, only electronic collections of the type aggregator and selective package have been included in Analytics e-inventory subject area. In order to use Analytics to analyze our entire body of collections, electronic collections of database type need to be included in Analytics. Are the electronic collections of type database going to be added to Analytics soon?
Yes, in fact, I believe, and this is information I learned just yesterday, so I will need to follow up on this to get some more definitive information, but I believe in the May release, the electronic collections with 0 portfolios, typically of the type database, were added to the e-inventory subject area. So I saw an example report that one of my colleagues in support created that previously would have resulted in those electronic collections dropping, but they did not drop. Now, I don't have all the details at hand for this, so I will look into that and get some more definitive information. But my understanding is that that as of the recent release, it should now be possible to create reports like that weren't previously possible.
Okay, thank you. Another question, this one from Alex. If you have items with multiple volumes where the volume number is not noted in the enum A field, would those show up in the report?
I'm actually very glad you asked that question. The report that we looked at in would not, but that is because of a filter that we chose for this one. So if I go to this report really quickly here, we added A is not null filter, so that is filtering out all the results that do not have volume information. You could delete this, but I also wanted to mention that we have a bonus report that we didn't get to cover today. That's the exercise for this is in our accompanying document. And for this report, we actually look at items that do not have volume information in the enum A field, but have descriptions that might include volume. So we see some examples here where we've got some volume information. Extracting this volume information was not really possible, or at least not very easy with built-in functions in analytics, but the last advanced function that we looked at, the regular expression substring function, is able to do this. And in our document, we actually look at that in the very last section in this bonus section. And I believe I can find it here really quick. For our data, this was the regular expression that we ended up coming up with. It was a little more complicated than the one that we looked at in the session, but it was a good demonstration of how these advanced functions can help you identify tasks like this, where, once you're able to extract the volume information from the description, you could use this to go back to those items and add the volume to the enum A field if it was missing that.
Okay, another question. This one from Jeff. If there's time, can you please repeat the explanation of what the regex substring arguments are doing, the %1, %2, and so on?
Sure. So the %1 and 2 is actually basically a shorthand. We're using this to reference these fields. And the reason we're doing this is to make this both easier to reuse and also to avoid a syntax issue that is kind of unusual. Basically, if we wanted to, we could put the regular expression directly into this. For some reason, we need to use 2 single quotes if we do that. It's a bizarre problem with escaping the characters properly. So when we have these % signs, these are just saying, look at these fields. So these 6 fields that are in the evaluate function, these are being entered into these. Now for the parameters themselves, the regular expression parameters themselves, while I was presenting this sort of simplified version of the syntax that lists each of these parameters, the Oracle documentation actually dives more deeply into each of these parameters. And having seen an example, I think this diagram makes a little bit more sense than it does on first glance. But basically, each of these parameters is defined here. So the first parameter, the source character, they refer to as a character expression. Basically, this can be a field, or it could be a static value, like a string. In our example, we always enter the field in to this first parameter, so that would be the 852 mark in the example we looked at earlier. In the bonus report, we look at it. We enter the physical item description into that one. The pattern parameters is where you enter your. Basically, you separate that regular expression by single quotes, and then the regular expression syntax is defined separately. The available syntax that you can use is defined separately in this document, and also tools like RegXer can be used to try to figure out what you should put in for that parameter. Position is basically where that substring search starts. So if it's not specified, or if it's entered as 1, that searches the beginning of the 852 mark or the physical item description or whatever other field you're using. If you were to enter another value, you would essentially ignore the first portion of the string that you were looking for that pattern in. Occurrence is the occurrence of that pattern. So basically, if your regular expression matches multiple occurrences within your data, so the example I gave was an 852 with 2 subfield C's. I suppose it might be possible in the other example for a description to have maybe multiple volumes or something like that. You could specify that you actually want the second occurrence of that, so the second subfield C that appears in the data rather than the first. But by default, this is 1, so it looks for the first occurrence of that pattern. Match parameter is something that can change the default match parameters. In Oracle's documentation, they apparently only define this in a different function that we didn't have time to talk about, that was called the regex count. It basically extends the count function using and allowing you to use these regular expressions. But they provide some values here that you can use to change that match behavior. I think the most common one that you would use would be case insensitive matching. While you can specify, both upper and lower case in a regular expression by creating a set like this, it makes it more compact and more readable if you already know that you want to ignore, whether it's upper or lower case. You can specify this flag. So in our function, we would basically replace this with a single quote and an I, lowercase I. That if we were in our 852 example, because we didn't want to use it, we just entered null, so that would be the default value, which is that we're not making any changes to that behavior. And then finally, the sub-expression, as this mentions, it's matching a part of the pattern, not the entire pattern. I think it's easiest to understand that in the context of regular expression capture groups, where you don't actually want the portion of that field that you're using to match the data. So the subfield C, you just actually want the data within the subfield C. There's another example that we were originally going to present on for this, which is OCLC numbers. So it used to be the case that the OCLC numbers for your records would only appear in the network, I believe it was the network number field. Let me just check that really quickly. Difficult to get this OCLC number out, if you didn't want this other information in here. And we had a fairly complex OCLC regular expression pattern that would match these prefixes, and then we would use a capture group to essentially only get the digits from this. The reason we didn't present on this is actually good news, which is that our analytics developers added OCLC control number fields, and so now basically you can just enter these fields rather than needing to do this sort of complex matching. So that was introduced in the January 2020 release, I believe.
One more question, Dominic, and that's this. I have found it difficult to perform multiple replaces in the same function. Can you give some tips on that?
Sure. So I think in many cases, if you need to use 2 or 3 or 4 replace functions, that probably would be a good thing to use this regular expression substring function for. Just so that we can look at what we would do in this case. If we did want to continue using lots and lots of replace functions, so we had the example here of using ball and then a space and replacing that. But let's say we also wanted to replace volume. What we would need to do is net these replace functions. And so if we highlight this enum A field and then add another replace, we could then continue making multiple replacements. So we could replace volume in here, and then we could just keep adding more and more of these replaces. As you can see, this starts a very long expression, and it starts becoming kind of difficult to follow. Maybe we also have capital V, for example. That's why, if you're getting into a situation like this, if you need to make just 1 or 2 replacements, maybe it will be easier to use that replace function. But if you have lots and lots of different variations on this, you might consider using that regular expression substring function to make these kinds of replacements instead.
Okay, those are all of the questions that have not been answered. So I think we're in a good spot to conclude the session. Good timing.
Thank you, Connie and Dominic, for giving us this really in-depth, great presentation. And thank you all for your questions and for being active audience participants. We really appreciate it. And we hope we'll see you at other of the Best of Knowledge Days 2020 webinar series. Have an excellent day.